Good evening. Today, the Church in the United States celebrates the feast of St. Jane Frances de Chantal. Just as yesterday we celebrated St. Clare of Assisi, who is the beloved friend of St. Francis, so too today we celebrate St. Jane, who is the beloved friend of St. Francis de Sales. St. Jane Frances Frémillat was born into a noble family. She grew up around the age of 20. She was said to be very intelligent and very beautiful, and was married to the Baron von Chantal. They had a number of children together, some of whom died in infancy, and this devastated her. But she was still more devastated when her husband was killed in an accident. There she was left a widow and began to mourn for her husband. It took her a long time to forgive the person who had accidentally killed him. In the meantime, her father-in-law began to mistreat her. She was very pious, very charitable toward the poor. He had no time for her whatsoever. Eventually, she heard a sermon by the Bishop of Geneva, St. Francis de Sales. And through this sermon, which was preached on the love of God, she began to open her heart more and more to God and learned how to forgive the person who had killed her husband. She sought out St. Francis as a spiritual director. She immediately wanted to become a nun, but he counseled against it initially, told her to wait. And she waited for about 3 years, and eventually she founded with him an order of sisters, really who were not able, for reasons of health or reasons of age, to join other congregations. They founded together the Order of the Visitation. It was to this Order of Visitation that St. Francis wrote his famous treatise on the love of God. Jane Frances de Chantal teaches us that we can live out our vocation in joy, but that the vocation is actually a gift from God, whether it is to be a wife or a mother or a nun or a foundress or a superior of a congregation. She lived out her faith in God with a joyful spirit, even though her own diaries and letters indicate that interiorly she suffered greatly. She suffered the loss of her children, suffered the loss of her husband. Later on, one of her other sons died. Her daughter-in-law died. Her son-in-law died. Death was all around her. There was even the plague during her time. But she carried on. Even in the midst of desolation, even in the midst of spiritual dryness and darkness, she said, I will be faithful to God. And that's what we are called to do in difficult moments in our own vocation, to be faithful to God, whether it's to be faithful to the promises of our baptism, the promises of our marriage, the promises of our priesthood or religious consecration, to be faithful in all things. Sometimes we have to be faithful even by embracing our cross, but it's here that we find true joy. St. Jane believed that the secret of happiness was in losing ourselves. She said that we should throw ourselves into God as a little drop of water into the sea and lose ourselves indeed in the ocean of divine goodness. How beautiful that even in the midst of grief or fear, we can throw ourselves into the ocean of God's love, which is an infinite ocean. It is interesting to hear what St. Vincent de Paul had to say about St. Jane. She was full of faith, yet all her life had been tormented by thoughts against it. While apparently enjoying the peace and easiness of mind of souls who have reached a high state of virtue, she suffered such interior trials that she often told me her mind was so filled with all sorts of temptations and abominations that she had to strive not to look within herself. But for all that suffering, her face never lost its serenity, nor did she once relax in the fidelity God asked of her. And so I regard her as one of the holiest souls I have ever met on this earth. I wonder how many people would say that about us. We are one of the holiest souls they ever met on the whole earth. I wonder how serene we are in the midst of great suffering. Is not our inclination more and more to complain about what has gone wrong? Is it not more and more to retaliate against those who have harmed us? Is it not to be stubborn in not forgiving and instead holding on to grudges? We are so different from St. Jane. So what was the key? I think the key was simply her love of God. This is what I believe she learned from St. Francis de Sales. To simply be. To be in God's presence. To allow oneself to be loved by God. And in being loved by God, to want to offer one's whole life for one's beloved. Literally, to throw oneself into God, like the little drop of water in the infinite ocean of God's love. May St. Jane Frances de Chantal, who lived many vocations, be an inspiration for us to live ours more faithfully this day and every day. May God bless you.